In presentations of Zoroastrianism, the ancient Iranian/Central Asian religion that was an important aspect of the great Persian empires and which would have a major impact on the major world religions, we are often given a fixed view of a very dualistic system. This is something that we covered in my overview on Zoroastrianism too. The world on all levels is divided into the realities of Asha, which means truth or order and justice, on the one hand, and on the other hand something called Druj, which means the lie or deception and chaos, represented by the great creator god Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom, and Angra Mainyu or Ahriman, respectively. This is, of course, helpful in order to understand what at least a major part of Zoroastrianism has looked like historically. But as we also said in that video, it's very true that Zoroastrianism has been a very diverse tradition and that it didn't look the same over all the millennia in which it has existed. Indeed, it isn't until the Sasanian Empire, and even in the post-Islamic period to some degree, that we see anything resembling a kind of Zoroastrian orthodoxy or fixed set of beliefs and texts in the way that we know it today. And so, of course, this tradition has contained a lot of different perspectives and interpretations across that history. Not only is it true that many Zoroastrians today interpret the religion in a much more monotheistic or even monistic way, especially if we base ourselves only on the earliest Gatha scriptures attributed to Zarathustra, but there have also existed various different branches and sects and new movements within the wider religion that have also given new and different interpretations of their theology. One of the most interesting and famous of these is something known as Zurvanism, which challenged the very dualistic picture of these two divine forces, Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, by introducing an even higher deity or divinity above these, known as Zervan, which means time. Two things before we start the video. Number one, I have just today, hopefully, or at least very recently, depending on when this comes out, I have just released a new song or single with my band Zini. The song is called Before It's Too Late. It's a very personal, kind of introspective, slow song about grief. And I would really appreciate if you wanted to check it out and let me know what you think. It's available on all streaming platforms. It's also on my other channel, Philip Holm. There's a video version of it there. So go check it out, share it if you like it, tag me in videos about it, and leave a comment and so on. I would really appreciate it. Secondly, this is a collaboration with the scholar of Zoroastrianism, Pablo Vasquez, from the channel Soul Roots. And he'll be appearing in this video a bit later on, but also be sure to check out that channel. Go subscribe to him for some really good Zoroastrianism content from someone who not only studies Zoroastrianism academically, but also is a practicing Zoroastrian themselves, which gives a very valuable perspective, of course. So go check out Soul Roots and stay tuned for Pablo to show up later on in this episode. There are different understandings and interpretations of Zoroastrian theology or philosophy, as we have noted in my dedicated episode on the topic. The classic picture that most are familiar with is one of a strict dualism between Asha and Druj, Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, as fundamentally opposed ontological forces that are in constant battle with each other. This kind of worldview would also later be picked up by religions like Manichaeism and possibly certain quote-unquote Gnostic movements. But others interpret the Zoroastrian worldview in a different way, especially those who want to primarily highlight the earliest text of the Zoroastrian canon, the Gathas attributed to Zarathustra. They imagine that the philosophy presented in these original texts is not dualistic, but instead give other interpretations. The forces like Ahura Mazda are described as psychological aspects of the human mind, for example, and even an outright monistic reading in line with the related Vedic traditions that we find in Indic texts like the Upanishads. Whatever the case, later Zoroastrian texts and practices certainly lean towards a dualistic worldview, even if it is of course more nuanced than that. And since the topic today will mostly revolve around later developments in the wider phenomena of Zoroastrianism, this is the basic view that we will have as our basis. This dualistic interpretation of the theology is kind of where our starting point, let's say. As you will know if you've watched or listened to my general Zoroastrianism episode, aside from Ahura Mazda, there are a bunch of other divine figures that were worshipped by the Zoroastrians, known as Yazatas, or those worthy of worship, and the even more exalted Ameshaspentas, the bountiful or blessed immortals. These are, of course, interpreted differently as well, but can generally be seen as divinities or forces that represent different aspects of reality. Things like natural phenomena like wind, or more abstract concepts such as space, both represented by the figure Vayu. And among these other forces that came to play an important role in the religion, there came to prominence at some point a divinity referred to as Zurvan. This is a word that simply means time, and, as Albert de Jong points out, seems to originally specifically refer to a period of time, rather than time as a more abstract sense. Zurvan was accompanied by other Yazatas that represented similar fundamental features of the cosmos, such as Vayu, who, quote, is associated with the void between the realms of light and darkness. In other words, although Zurvan, or its earlier Avestan forms like Zruan, is mentioned in the sacred text of the Avestas and seemed to have been worshipped or revered to some degree by Zoroastrians, this was only as one among the many other Yazatas that existed in the Zoroastrian quote-unquote pantheon, so to say. But something very dramatic seems to have happened later on in history, especially from the Sasanian period, from the 4th century AD or so, when Zurvan started to take on a much more prominent role, at least in some aspects or groups within this religion. Now, there are a number of problems with approaching this topic and trying to understand it from a perspective that is historically nuanced and supported. First of all, there are essentially no internal Zoroastrian sources that mention Zurvanism as such. Instead, each mention of this cosmology or idea comes from outside, famously by Arabic-speaking writers like Muhammad ash-Shahrastani, which is also a very late source from a time deep into the Islamic era, but also some earlier Greek sources like the Neoplatonist philosopher Damascus in the 6th century, as well as Syriac and Armenian Christian writers around that same time. Scholars are thus left with fragments and outside speculation and not much else, especially in terms of sources from Zoroastrians at that time themselves, and so they are left to make a lot of educated speculation and interpretation about what this Zurvanism was supposed to be. So let's begin by looking at what some of these writers say about it. We begin with Damascus, who writes, trying to recount the beliefs of the Zoroastrians, or quote-unquote Iranians more generally. He says, quote, "As for the Magi and the entire Iranian race, as Eudemus writes about this, some of them call the intelligible and unified universe space, topos, and others call it time, chronos, from which are differentiated either a good deity and a bad deity, or light and darkness before these, as some say. And they then themselves posit the twofold differentiated rank of the superiors after the undifferentiated nature, one leader of which is Mazda, and the other of which is Airamainos." Damascus here mentions chronos, or time, which is the Greek equivalent of Zurvan, and he also mentions space, as fundamental principles from which come both light and darkness, or Mazda and Airamainos, which are of course Greekified versions of Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu. Interesting. Furthermore, and maybe most famously, in Muhammad ash-Shahrastani's pioneering work of comparative religion, Kitab al-Milal wal-Nihal, the Book of Sects and Creeds, he talks about different sects or schools of Zoroastrianism, one of which is Zurvanism. And lastly, we can look at the Christian Armenian theologian Esnik of Kolb, writing in the 5th century in his Against the Sects about the supposed cosmology of the Zoroastrians. He says, quote, Before anything was, they say, heaven or earth or any other creature in heaven or earth, there was someone with the name Zurvan, which is translated as fortune or glory. For 1,000 years he sacrificed so that he may have a son, whose name should be Vormezd, and who make heaven and earth and everything in it. And after 1,000 years of sacrificing, he began to reflect and said, will the sacrifice I am making be useful, and will I indeed have this son called Vormezd, or will my labor be in vain? And while he still thought this, Vormezd and Ahriman were conceived in the womb of their mother, Vormezd from the sacrifice, and Ahriman from his doubt. When he understood this, Zurvan said, 2 sons are in the belly there. Whoever of them may arrive first with me, I will make king. Vormezd learned the thoughts of the father and revealed them to Ahriman. He said, Zurvan our father thought that whoever of us will come to him first shall be made king. After Ahriman had heard this, he pierced the belly, went out, and came before the father. Zurvan saw him and did not know who it was. He asked, who are you? And Ahriman said, I am your son. Zurvan said to him, my son is well smelling and bright, but you are gloomy and stinking. And while they were speaking this with each other, Vormezd was born in his own time, bright and odorous. He came before Zurvan, and when Zurvan saw him, he knew that he was Vormezd, his son, for whom he had sacrificed. And he took the twigs which he had in his hand, and with which he made the sacrifice, gave them to Vormezd, and said, up to now I sacrificed for you, from now on you shall sacrifice for me. When Zurvan gave the twigs to Vormezd and blessed him, Ahriman approached Zurvan and said to him, did you not vow in this manner, whoever of my 2 sons arrives first with me, I will make king? And Zurvan, in order not to break his vow, said to Ahriman, oh, you false and wicked one, the reign will be given to you 9,000 years, but with Vormezd over you as king, and after 9,000 years Vormezd shall reign, and what he may intend to do, he shall do. At that time Vormezd and Ahriman began to make creatures, and everything which Vormezd made was good and right, and that which Ahriman fashioned was bad and twisted. What we find in these accounts are a version of the story that might appear strange to those who are used to the classic version of Zoroastrian teachings. And Western scholars in previous centuries thought so too. You see, the way Zoroastrianism had been understood was essentially as a dualistic religion. Ahura Mazda is the high god who represents all things good and just, in other words Asha, and Angra Mainyu is the opposite, the evil spirit representing evil, lies, and chaos, or Druj. They are the 2 opposing fundamental ontological forces, twins who together create the world we know. Good things come from Ahura Mazda, and bad things from Angra Mainyu, and they are indeed mentioned as twins in the Avesta scriptures. As Western scholars reconstructed Zoroastrian beliefs, as they themselves say, which is kind of strange, and Zoroastrian still exists today, so how would you reconstruct it? But anyway, as they did that, this was seen as a kind of orthodoxy, a Zoroastrian orthodoxy, right? So the only debate was around whether Zoroastrianism could be seen as a monotheistic religion or if it was a strictly dualistic one. This has been the kind of main debate. So is it a monotheistic religion in the sense that Ahura Mazda is the high god and Angra Mainyu is some kind of being below him that still opposes him and is the source of evil and these things, but they are not equal, or if it's a truly dualistic one where they are equal ontological opposing forces. This is the main, or has been the main debate. And this is a significant debate, especially for some, because if one would argue that Zoroastrianism is monotheistic, then one could easily make the case, possibly, that Zoroastrianism might then be the earliest form of monotheism in history. In these sources, however, we get a very different picture, one where Zurvan is portrayed as an even higher single god above the 2 twins, and that the latter were born only from Zurvan, thus being secondary. This turns the very core of what Zoroastrian teachings are supposed to be on its head. But as we explored in my previous video on Zoroastrianism, things aren't that simple. Zoroastrianism was a tradition that, first of all, changed a lot over the centuries, so that the way it was practiced during the Achaemenid Empire could be drastically different from how it is practiced in the Sasanian times. Some would argue that the two can't even be seen as a single religion, that there wasn't a Zoroastrian religion before Sasanian times, right? This is an argument that some people make. But secondly, all these categories and terms that we use to understand religion, monotheism, dualism, polytheism, are words of a later, mostly European context, and to apply them to something like Zoroastrianism isn't really always helpful. While Ahura Mazda was a kind of high god, there were also many lower divinities or Yazatas that were worshipped throughout the centuries, famous ones like Mithra and Anahita, for example. So Zoroastrianism doesn't really fit into our neat, preconceived categories, but is a unique and dynamic religious tradition. It wasn't until quite late in the Sasanian and even into the Islamic period that Zoroastrianism started to, number one, write down and collect the Avesta rather than it being orally transmitted. So this is the main collection of Zoroastrian sacred texts. They were written down in this later period. And two, this also resulted therefore in that there started to develop a kind of more fixed orthodox version of its theology and teachings, probably partly as a result of the appearance of religions like Christianity and Islam that challenged Zoroastrians and emphasized orthodoxy as we understand it. And this will become important later, but the reason I bring this up is that as scholars, primarily Western scholars, discovered these references to this Zervan character and this alternative cosmological or ontological creation myth, they were perplexed because this went against what they saw as this kind of Zoroastrian orthodoxy that they perceived. And so the way that they understood that, or tried to frame it, was to say that sometime in late antiquity, during Sasanian times, there appeared a kind of sect, a separate sect within Zoroastrianism that we then call Zurvanism. That this is its own kind of group, its own sect within the religion. This is how it's usually presented even today. A kind of heretical movement that was separate from the standard orthodox Zoroastrianism. Now this interpretation was of course helped by writers like Shahrastani, who do seem to talk about it in terms of being a specific sect or school, even back in medieval times. And as I said, this has kind of been the prevailing theory or way of talking about it until this very day. But many scholars have also pushed back against this, arguing that this is based on a misconstrued idea of what this orthodoxy is supposed to be, that this Zervanite movement is supposed to be competing against, so to say. In reality, things were probably a lot more complex and nuanced. But so what was Zurvanism then? Was it actually a kind of sect of its own that became prominent, or was it simply a theological interpretation that was popular at that time? We have talked about some of this, but at this point I would like to hand it over to the scholar of Zoroastrianism, Pablo Vasquez, also from the channel Soul Roots, to explain a bit more about his theories and the scholarly debates about the nature of Zurvanism itself.
Zurvanism remains one of the great mysteries of the ancient Zoroastrian era. We're not particularly sure what it was. We do know some people believed in something that could be considered Zurvanism. We also know that at times it may have been in vogue and out of vogue, in and out, depending on which emperor was in power, or perhaps even which high priest was in charge of the faith at that time. But what I can definitely say is there are some academic speculations. I lean more towards that Zurvanism is further example of what we can call the greater body of Mazda Yasna. See, Zoroastrianism as we know it today is just the most popular form of Mazda Yasna that survived the ancient era. So Mazda Yasna encompasses a great variety of different faiths. There was the Sogdian Mazda Yasna, there was Armenian Mazda Yasna, and so forth. And we have clues of this through different books and different discussions that have emerged from the ancient era and also the Middle Persian era that kind of show us that different belief system existed within this grand umbrella. Now, is that to say that Zurvanism was some sort of separate sect? No, absolutely not. I wouldn't consider it to be any sort of separate sect, but in reality, more of beliefs that develop probably through folk beliefs or perhaps even at an intellectual level. It could have been passed down family lines, priestly family lines most likely, or it actually could have just developed in discussion groups, kastags, these schools of thoughts that existed back in ancient Zoroastrian times. What we can say then is that Zurvanism wasn't particularly something distinct. It wasn't simply something that could be considered its own separate religion or its own separate sect, or even perhaps even its own school of thought. We just know that some people may have believed that Zurvan, which most Zoroastrians nowadays consider to be the Yazata of time, is indeed a higher level than Ahura Mazda. But this seemed to even have been disputed by Zurvanites at the time, from what little we can tell in the documents. So, all in all, it may have just been a different cosmological attempt at understanding why the problem of evil existed, or why time operated the way it did, or even perhaps to understand the coming of the Saoshyant, the great saviors of Middle Persian Zoroastrianism. But, as I said, it's a great mystery. And in all truth, we won't really know what the Zurvanites or Zurvanism or this whole Zurvan movement, if there existed one, was really like until we get more and more evidence. So what we're saying in this video is basically what everyone else knows so far. And thus, we're presenting probably the best explanations possible. I'm just presenting what is academic theory and what I lean towards as a scholar and also as a Zoroastrian myself. And that, again, is that we don't know. Zurvanism may have just been some sort of folk or even just a priestly scholarly belief, but it clearly disappeared after a very short while, actually, in the long scheme of Zoroastrianism, and is now relegated to footnotes in history books.
Thank you so much for that, Pablo, and be sure, everyone, to check out the channel Soul Roots for really great Zoroastrianism content. There will be links in the description, and this is also a shared video, so you can see it in the channel description under the video. His channel should be there, so go subscribe and check that out. But where did this Zurvanite myth come from, and why did it become so popular, especially at this time? There are many theories regarding the origin of the myth. Some scholars have wanted to point to sources outside the Zoroastrian tradition itself, that Manichaeism or Mithraism played an important role, or that it was influenced by Babylonian and Greek religious myth. For example, we find in the Greek mythical pantheon that Kronos, the god of time, is the father of both Zeus and Poseidon, in a sense placing the concept of time above the highest god as a kind of parent. Could this have inspired the Zoroastrians to adopt a similar theology? We can't rule it out, of course, but a strong argument can also be made that the prominence of Zurvan developed from within Zoroastrian tradition itself. In particular, there is a section in the Yazatas, the oldest scripture of Zoroastrianism, often thought to have been written by Zarathustra himself, which says, quote, "The great choice by which the charitable ones choose correctly, while the miserly do not, is between the twin spirits, who have existed since the start of what is, manifesting themselves in our minds and visions, who are opposites in thoughts, words, and deeds. For one is truly the most virtuous of choices, while the other is not." This verse talks about the two twins, which has often been interpreted in the dualistic sense of Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu. And since they are described as twins, the conclusion, according to some, must be that they have a parent. Thus, the Zurvan myth might have appeared or become popular as a way of explaining or interpreting that statement in the Yazatas. Furthermore, we also see speculation about the importance of time and space as foundational for reality in the Yasna ceremony. De Jong says, quote, "The Yasna ceremony ends with an invocation of this deity, in the company of the related gods Raman, Thwasha, and Vayu, representing the void between the worlds of light and darkness, suggesting speculation on the structure of the cosmos in terms of space and time as the precondition for the genesis of our present world of mixture. The idea of time as this foundational principle, coming even before the quote-unquote twins of Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, seems like a logical and possible conclusion as a result of these factors. Now, the reason why this myth or form of theology seems to have become so popular and widespread in the Sasanian period is an even harder question to answer. It seems relatively certain that it did, though, since the earliest references to this myth comes from the 4th century, followed by many such mentions for centuries thereafter. The Zervanite myth as such, of course, might have earlier origins, though. Indeed, in an article about the topic, Mary Boyce argues, based on research of people like Cumont, that it might have appeared as early as Achaemenid times, but its prominence and popularity certainly reached its peak during the Sasanian period. As we saw before, and as we discussed in my larger video on Zoroastrianism, it was really during this period that we saw the proper emergence of a priestly class among the Zoroastrians, dedicated scholars who would try to establish something like an official version of the theology, something that, by all accounts, does not seem to have been the case earlier. Maybe this was the result of other emerging religions like Christianity that over time developed a creedal orthodoxy, like the Nicene Creed, for example. It is probably in these elite settings among the priests, the Magi, that Zurvanism as such was born and grew to prominence. This project of orthodoxifying the religion by professional theologians was, of course, deeply connected to the political agenda of the Sasanian state as well, just as it was for the Romans and Christianity. It thus isn't a surprise that Zurvanism, the theological interpretation with Zervan as the highest force, a perhaps more monistic rather than dualistic system, seems to have been the mainstream and official form of Zoroastrianism in the Sasanian court and among the learned elite at this time. Now, another question that becomes quite relevant when keeping all this in mind is that if Zurvanism, whatever it was so popular during Sasanian times, which it certainly seems to have been to some degree, how come it disappeared, and so quickly, right? It seems to have kind of withered out quite quickly, shortly thereafter, and then basically disappeared entirely from history. You'd be hard-pressed to find any Zoroastrian today that holds a Zervanite cosmology or theology. There are some, even some here in Sweden, but it's quite an unusual position even today. So what happened? How come this position, which was so popular and so prominent, how come it disappeared? And when did it disappear? As we saw, by the time Asharastani was writing in the 12th century, Zurvanism was still alive, or at the very least, remnants of its ideas were still fresh in the memory of people in the region. So it certainly didn't disappear overnight or immediately after the Arab conquests. Instead, scholars will point to that same tendency and development during the Sasanian period, the ascendance of the class of priests and their streamlining of the religion, and especially the fact that from the 6th century, the Avesta or sacred scriptures of the religion started to actually be written down and collected as texts for the first time. Earlier, such scriptures had essentially only been orally transmitted. And with this textual turn came a new attitude within the Zoroastrian scholarship and priesthood. Just like in textually based religions like Christianity and Islam, there was a bigger emphasis on searching for the orthodox, quote-unquote, teachings of the religion in the texts, especially quite naturally after the Arab conquest and the entrance of Islam into the region. Zurvanism and its myth had likely appeared through priestly speculation, but its formulation could not really be found in any place within the actual Avestan text. And if it couldn't be found in the text and thus have a firm textual basis, it started to lose its popularity. We see at the same time the loss in popularity of some of the deities that are not mentioned in the text, and we also see the gradual disappearance of Zurvanism and the crystallization of a textually based orthodoxy that was much more dualistic in nature. Another factor pointed out by the scholar De Jong is also that, because Zurvanism was so popular, especially among the elite and the court, the Sasanian court and kings, when the Arab conquest happened and the Sasanian Empire and its kings fell, that myth and that mythological structure didn't have the same support from the kings anymore. So that's probably also a factor here. By the time Shahrastani was writing in the 12th century, as we said, Zervanite ideas were still widely known. But it also seems that around this time or shortly after, they would essentially disappear altogether, and today only remains an interesting remnant of a bygone era in the history of one of the most important religions in the world. Zurvanism remains a source of fascination for those interested in the history of religion or the history of Iran. It's clear that it was a prominent quote-unquote movement or whatever it was during the Sasanian Empire, but what its relationship was to the wider community of Zoroastrians at that time, whether or not it represents a rupture in the religion into different schools or sects at the time, or if it's simply another example of the fact that Zoroastrianism, just like all religions, was complex, diverse, and doesn't fit into our fixed and narrow categories of definition, is hard to say with complete certainty. Although I certainly tend to lean toward the latter. This was a very interesting time for the religion, where other groups appeared as well, like the Mazdakites, for example, which certainly was a lot more of an actual sect or separate group, much more so than the topic that we've been covering today. And also where the contours of what we conceive of as standard or mainstream Zoroastrianism was really formulated and solidified for the first time. And hopefully we can cover, I really want to cover Mazdakism in a future episode as well. For now, I hope this was an informative companion episode to my larger video on Zoroastrianism, and that it cleared some things up about Zurvanism, or maybe rightfully made things even more complicated and confusing. Either way, I hope you found it interesting in some way. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Thank you to Pablo from Soul Roots, the channel Soul Roots, for appearing in this episode and collaborating with me. He helped me out with the research a lot, and he looked over my script and gave me comments. So this episode is definitely a collaboration in more ways than one, and I deeply appreciate the help and assistance from Pablo. So please, everyone, go check out the channel Soul Roots. It's really wonderful stuff. It's well produced, and he knows his stuff about Zoroastrianism, both academically and from an emic perspective, so to say. So I highly recommend it, so please do that. I would also like to remind you that I just released my new song, Before It's Too Late, with my band Zini. So I would also highly appreciate if you wanted to check that song out and let me know what you think, either in a comment or something like that. There are links to that in my link tree. You can also find it on Spotify and my other channel, Philip Holm. Thank you, as always, to my patrons for keeping the channel going. If you want to stay updated on me and my work, then you can find me on my socials, on Instagram and TikTok and so on. You can also check out my other channel, Philip Holm, which is dedicated to my music specifically, like, for example, checking out that new song that I just released, Before It's Too Late. It's on there, so check that out. Thank you again so much for watching. I look forward to exploring more Zoroastrianism and other related religions and traditions, and I will see you next time.